Welcome to Corwin's Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast with host Peter DeWitt. This podcast is from education leaders for education leaders. Every week, Peter and our guests get together to share ideas, put research into practice, and ensure every student is learning, not by chance, but by design.
Hey, Ariel, how are you doing today?
Hey, Peter, happy Monday. Our last episode of this season, our first season under wraps.
I cannot believe how quickly it went by. Honestly, thank you for asking me to do this, because the interviews, Jim Knight always talks about life-giving conversations. And I feel like a lot of these conversations were life-giving, where I just get to sit back and ask questions about books and research. It's like an education geek's biggest dream.
Yeah, well, I hope that everyone who has listened, this season and who is listening to this last episode has also felt like it's been life-giving to them and helped them really rekindle engagement in their schools.
Yeah, so these guys, Doug Fisher and Nancy Frey, obviously we know them. They are prolific writers, but some of the questions on their book on leading the rebound that I wanted to get to was, I feel like there are misperceptions about words. I've been spending a lot of time on that lately. And some words like teacher agency and teacher clarity and what does evidence mean? And they were perfect as the guests to be able to ask those questions just because of their body of work that they've had. Anything that Nancy and Doug said that stood out to you the most?
Yeah, well, they talk about this. I mean, speaking of the words we use and the impact of the words that we use, they talked a lot about this idea of learning loss. And we've talked about it other times, in this season, but I really love that they have very successfully kind of shifted the narrative from learning loss to what Doug calls learning leaps. And that narrative of learning loss is so detrimental for so many reasons. And you guys will get into it, but they talk about how to really positively reframe the message for teachers and for students, and to focus on these learning leaps. And there's a lot of different, practical things that you can do. And you cover that in this episode. So I think this is going to be it's a productive, practical episode that I'm really excited we're ending this season this way, so that teachers and leaders can just kind of hit the ground running.
Yeah, I feel like when you come to interview Doug Fisher and Nancy Frey, you have got to be prepared. So that's for sure. And there were two things that I wanted to be able to get to. One was the fact that they were talking about early warning systems. And just like with the learning loss, I wanted to get to the heart of when we're talking about learning loss, that also sort of intersects with this idea of the deficit mindset that we had talked about. So I'm glad that we got an opportunity to sort of clarify that. How can you do an early warning system at the same time you're conscious of implicit biases that you might have? And the other thing that I thought was important, and we ended with, was the fact that, it's easy to look at Doug and Nancy as these people that write for, they do a lot of writing, books, columns, articles, whatever. But the reality is where their work is really coming from is the school that they started in 2007. So
that's right.
Glad we got the opportunity to talk about that because it is clear that their school has a great impact on the work that they're doing. So yeah, overall, I think people are really going to be excited, and they're going to learn a lot through this conversation.
That's right. Well, let's listen in. Peter DeWitt with Doug Fisher and Nancy Frey.
So good morning, Doug Fisher and Nancy Frey. Welcome to the Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast. I'm really excited to have the both of you on this.
It's great to see you.
Yeah, it's been a while. We're always remote. So this season is about rekindling engagement. It looks like you have a perfect book coming out for rekindling engagement called Leading the Rebound. Can you both talk a little bit about what led you to write this book? And then we can get into some specific pieces and parts here too.
Well, I'll start. What led us to writing this in particular was living in real time with being school leaders and what the challenges are in doing so. And we wanted to make sure that we were not only capturing our own experiences, but also talking to thought leaders and, of course, collaborating with John Hattie is just the best in being able to do that. But as much as anything, the goal has really been, and this certainly has been echoed throughout the educational community, that as we return to school, we don't want to go back to school. We don't want to go back to the way schooling happened in 2019, but that we should really take advantage of this time to reconceive what it is that schooling looks like, to take stock in what it is that we have found collectively to be working and how it is that we want to make sure that we're addressing those gaps that have always been hiding there in plain sight.
And I would add the negative conversations that are going around. You know, all the kids are so far behind and it was terrible and the learning loss and all this narrative. We have responsibility as leaders to change that narrative. I'm not in denial that there isn't some unfinished learning or unrealized potential, but it's not like the 7th graders are starting to read like 2nd graders. I mean, we have no evidence that that happened. That's a huge loss. So how do we message hope? How do we message a sense that we can take care of this, we can do this? And actually, lots of kids were really learning. It wasn't convenient. We didn't want to do it this way, but it wasn't like learning stopped and we had a pause for a year. And so rebound, the idea of rebound is you come back stronger, you come back and you're energized and you can take on the things with a renewed sense of commitment and drive.
You know, Doug, I would like to stick there for just a minute because you're absolutely right. One of the things that I'm constantly hearing, whether it's through interviews that we're doing on the podcast or with the show A Seat at the Table that I do for Ed Week, one of the things that comes out is a lot of people, like researchers, authors, are saying things about, you know, let's stop talking about COVID loss because we've never been through anything like a pandemic before. Let's just look at it where we are, because even kids are not sitting there saying, I'm so far behind. The adults I hear from. But to me, there seems to be a little bit of a disconnect because I also coach school leaders and I work with school leaders. So there's this disconnect between what we seem to be saying as far as this whole idea of the COVID loss and the deficit mindset. And then I have leaders that are saying the kids are so far behind. How do you get rid of that disconnect that there seems to be?
Well, there is the popular narrative. I mean, the news is telling us there's a COVID slide. Yeah. The news is telling us, I mean, in California, we had Learning Loss Mitigation Fund. That was a state fund. That's what it was called. And so when that's the popular narrative, you look for evidence that it's true. And as you start to confront this, you know, so I do, you know, trainings with a group of principals, and you start to confront this and say, what were all the gains that your students had? Look at the relationship with families that we have now. Look at the tech skills, 3rd graders logging into Zoom meetings and troubleshooting technology glitches. I mean, that may not be all the skills you wanted them to learn, but they're actually doing some pretty cool things that we would have probably projected 5 or so years out for them to be able to do. When it comes to things that we measure in school, like reading and mathematics and science and history and, you know, those kinds of things, we're going to have to figure out where every kid is. And as you said, Peter, it's the whole world is in a pandemic. So learning loss, I don't know. But what if we say, here's where you are right now. It's where you are. And we're going to accelerate your learning. So one of the superintendents here in California says, every time he hears learning loss, he says, what will it take to create a learning leap? And so to counter that all the time. And I don't think we can come across as saying, you know, we're in denial that some kids really struggled in this pandemic, that some families lost jobs, they lost lives. We can't be in denial about that. But it wasn't that everybody regressed in significant ways. And there were some kids that that had the most amazing educational experience. Some of the kids that reported being bullied in physical school are thriving. Some students with disabilities are feeling so accomplished because of the hours of supplemental and intensive services they're receiving. So there are wins, but it really, when we rebound, the kids are where they are. And our superpowers are that we know how to teach them where they are and accelerate learning.
One of the things that I wonder if, and this is where the book comes from, one of the quotations that you have early on in the book is, in too many cases, children, youth, and adults have come to believe that their efforts are not making a difference and that anything they do results in failure. Did you write that partly because of what we were just talking about with the whole idea of the learning loss and the sort of that confirmation bias? Oh, see, we told you that they're not learning as much. And so is that where that quotation came from? And how do we get, because this negative rhetoric around education has been around since like the 80s. It's been around for a long time, probably even further before A Nation at Risk. How do we get around that negative rhetoric? Nancy?
I think one of the very first places that we need to pay attention to as school leaders is in thinking about teacher agency. That rhetoric around learning loss, by the way, is being absolutely internalized by teachers who are then interpreting that as meaning my efforts, I'm working harder than I've ever worked. My efforts are not making a difference. My efforts are not leading to anything that's meaningful, which first of all is not true. But second of all, I think that that's really job one for us as school leaders, rebuilding teacher agency, making sure in very material kinds of ways that teachers are able to connect their efforts to what it is that is being accomplished with students. So for example, changing up how it is that we talk to teachers in observations and classroom visits and things like that, being very intentional about saying things like, when you did X, Y happened. Did you notice that? When you modeled your thinking, there were several kids who seemed to just understand all of a sudden. And did you notice that they started asking you questions? That we have to really make very specific connections so that teachers see that their efforts matter.
I would imagine that your wildly popular PLC Plus program probably does this as well. I remember there was a study that I read of just your typical PLCs, I guess, for lack of a better way of saying it, from the Boston consulting firm. I think it came out in 2016, that said PLCs were the most disliked form of collaboration on the part of teachers, and yet administrators love PLCs. Mm-hmm. They think, hey, I'm giving my teachers all this collaboration time. So what I enjoy about the fact that what you just said, Nancy, is that when rebuilding teacher agency, which is actually like number 3, chapter 3 in the contents of this book on leading the rebound, I would imagine that's been a big part of your PLC Plus program as well, which is why it becomes more popular. So I want people to understand that, when we hear about PLCs, when some teachers hear about PLCs and maybe they don't know about PLC Plus, they're thinking, oh, great, PLCs, yeah, that's where I have a voice in air quotations. But in reality, in your program, it actually is where they have voice. Would you say that's correct?
I would say that's correct. That was the whole point of redesigning and upgrading the PLC process. It's been around since the 70s. It has such potential if you can actually get to collective efficacy. The problem is most of the time it's just another meeting that we endure. And, and if you don't believe that having this conversation is going to help you and help your students, then it's compliance. I have to go to my PLC. And if I can schedule a dentist appointment at that time, even better, because then I have a valid excuse. I'd rather get my teeth drilled than go to that meeting. And so that's what we had to confront, is the potential of bringing groups of adults together to talk about what kids needed to learn, to recognize they've already learned some things, and to figure out how to move that learning forward. If we could actually do that and operationalize and put practices into place, so we change people's beliefs, but also the evidence that they collect to say, yes, we are making a difference. And that's that agency. And in a lot of PLC models, the grown-ups have been left out. Sorry, Peter. The grown-ups have been left out. And the original PLC was teachers and students learning more.
I'm sorry, I started to jump in because you got me really excited there, Doug. So, you said something about the 1970s, and I always look back and think like instructional leadership, that's where, Edmund started to look at in the 1970s. You've got Bandura, self-efficacy in the 1970s, PLCs in the 1970s. And one of the other things that I started to see was developed in the 1970s, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, is teacher clarity. The Cruikshank and their work around teacher clarity. Both of you have been really in depth about teacher clarity, do a lot of work where teacher clarity is involved. You have this as a part of the book. For people that don't, because I work with a lot of leaders that don't look for teacher clarity. When they're doing learning walks, we're doing remote learning walks, those kind of things. Teacher clarity is not the number one thing on their mind. So can you talk a little bit to this whole idea you wrote, guide teacher clarity? What does that mean when it comes to leading the rebound?
Well, teacher clarity, I think, is going to be one of those issues that is absolutely central to being able to accelerate student learning, to be able to have those learning leaps, as Doug spoke of. One of the tasks in being able to move learning forward more quickly is to understand what John Almarode likes to say, the difference between need to know and needs to know. And that's in many cases going to also require some reconceptualization of what those units of instruction look like, which means that teachers are going back to looking at what the standards are asking for, what the skills and the concepts are, and then how do we communicate those really clearly to young people, and how do we fold assessment and weave assessment into those practices so that we can speed up learning. That umbrella term of teacher clarity is really representative of a host of ways in which teachers think about learning and how it is that they can speed up the learning of their students.
One of and I'm glad you said that, Nancy, because one of the things that we started to see, especially when it was, last March, we're over a year into this. Last March, when we went into pandemic teaching and learning, what I noticed on Facebook, especially the teaching pandemic pages on Facebook, was the fact that people were looking for the tools. Tell me what tool you're using. Tell me what tool you're using. And it wasn't, a lot of the conversation was not around teacher clarity. It was not around standards or anything like that. It was around the tool. And when I surveyed students during the summer of 2020, one of the things they said is that they disliked the fact that teachers might be, speaking for 45 minutes and they don't get an opportunity to speak. When you're talking about teacher clarity, because when we say teacher clarity, it sort of seems like, okay, how much time is the teacher actually talking during this, right? It's not the teacher talks for 45 minutes and then they get 15 minutes to do a collaboration activity. When it comes to teacher clarity, is there like a time amount that we should be looking at to say, okay, if we hit that, we're moving a little bit too far and we're doing too much of the talking. Does that question make sense?
It does. And we've had this conversation over the years. And John Hattie says somewhere between 80 and 90% of the time teachers are talking. And he's got some new report coming out of hundreds of hours of classroom recordings. We set a goal here in our local district that it was 50% student to student interaction, not necessarily consecutive 50%, because 5-year-olds aren't going to talk for 25 minutes all at once. As they get older, they're going to more likely do that. But we set this goal that 50% of the minutes on average would be student to student interaction. And we wanted to see what would happen in the schools that did it. And the schools that got there what happened was when they got there, There was a lot of collaborative learning, a lot of academic interaction, and the teachers had time to meet with smaller groups of kids because they didn't want to meet with small groups of students if everybody else was doing independent, practice work for big chunks of time. And they really beat the odds. And we wrote this article with the assistant superintendent at the time, something, it's like all about the talk or something like that. And in a district with 28,000 kids, when you increase the amount of student to student interaction using academic language, it appears that the instruction, the amazing instruction, has a chance of sticking. Because that's when those kids were consolidating and they're negotiating meaning and they're arguing and they're disagreeing and they're reaching consensus and all of those processes that start to build together. And when you think about it, that was our precursor for another idea. We were having a conversation a couple of years ago, 3 years ago now, with John Hattie, and he said, well, if it's collective efficacy, Bandura never said it was limited to grown-ups. Even though the research in education went collective teacher efficacy, and now you've all been talking about more collective leadership efficacy. But then John said, well, why isn't there collective student efficacy? And there's no research on this. There's one study done, no meta-analysis, but isn't it logical that if we actually built collective student efficacy, rather than the old days of push the chairs together and, cooperate, if you will, but if we actually built collective student efficacy, wouldn't they learn more? Just like grownups do, just like business, just like leaders, like your work on leaders. So we started thinking about that, and it took a long time to really work through the ideas of what it would take to build collective student efficacy. But that's the reason, is going way back to, we're trying to set up 50% of the minutes on average across a week to be that interaction time.
I'm glad you brought that up too. One of the preconditions I know that the three of you have spoken about is the skills to work in collectives. And as you both know, one of the columns that you wrote for educational leadership that I find a lot of value in is the whole idea of reciprocal teaching. You have a great video that goes along with it. When people are looking for that practical side of, okay, so we're talking about the fact that kids need to learn how to work collectively together, but what does that look like? Would you say reciprocal teaching is one of those strategies that you can use to develop, for kids to develop the skills to work in collectives? Is that where those kind of meet hand in hand?
Absolutely. There's decades worth of research around the value of reciprocal teaching, in particular, as a great strategy to be able to do so, especially because it reflects reading comprehension strategies. It's what readers do, and it's bringing those ideas out into the open. But I think that there's also a caution there as well. And that is that if we're going to truly develop collective student efficacy, then we have to make sure that we're not hyper-focused only on a set of processes and procedures without attending to, for example, what's the social cohesion of the group? How is it that we make sure that we're fostering student leadership within those groups? How do we ensure that the tasks that students are doing have a sense of collective responsibility and not just, oh, we've got to get this done because she told us that we had to do it. So those procedures like that are incredibly valuable, but they are diminished somewhat in value if the only focus is on getting this particular task done without also looking closely at the development of those young humans that are in that group.
Nancy, I would add that the whole idea of the collective student efficacy, much like adults, is I and we will be better, in this case, learn more as a result of this. It's not the orientation of I'm going to get this job done. It's that I and we actually learn more from going through this process.
Which is why that whole idea of one of your other preconditions I know is the confidence to work in collectives. So I would imagine that that's where that piece comes in. One of the issues that people seem to have, educators and leaders will struggle with, and I know this just because they've actually flat out said, what does evidence look like? And you wrote use assessments for a range of purposes. And you may not remember this, but I do. One of the very first times that I ever reached out to you was you had co-authored a book with Cheryl Ward. And one of the quotations at the very beginning I've used quite a bit, which is schools are awash with data, but they don't always know what to do with it. And so when you put use assessments for a range of purposes, what exactly does that mean? Because I know that this is an area where we talk about self-efficacy and we talk about confidence. Not everybody has a lot of confidence in this. So what was the focus there?
I'll start, and then Nancy certainly can add. We've kind of taken on this this idea that there's a false dichotomy between formative and summative. And we say there really is no such thing as a formative assessment or a summative assessment. And, in the past, we kind of let it go, but it's become this absolute dichotomy in teaching is if it's formative, you can never use it for anything else. Or if it's summative, you can't use it. Well, all data can be used either way. There are good and bad uses of it, but we have to stop thinking of this false dichotomy and think more along a continuum. And why are we using, what data are we going to collect? Why are we collecting this data? And what's the intended use for this data? And that requires that we start to think like an evaluator, not like an assessor. And evaluators make improvements in the programs they evaluate. And so we're trying to shift this from, there are a variety of uses of data. There's also a variety of grain sizes. There's like moment by moment, lesson by lesson, week by week. There's grain sizes that make a difference in how you're going to assess learning. But we're at the place now where we've taken a position that we want to increase student self-assessment. We want teachers to provide tools for students so they can self-assess. So the role of the educator becomes less of, I'm the decider of your learning, I'm the arbiter of your learning, I'm the judge of your learning, but rather, I am the validator or challenger based on what you said in your self-assessment.
I'll further link that up to issues around teacher clarity. As you know, that's really just this umbrella of particular practices. And one of those is clarity of assessment. And that clarity of assessment is meant to be a two-way street. It is not just assessing young people to find out where they are now or where they were compared to a couple of weeks ago. It's also meant to be feedback to me, to the teacher, about how it is that my instruction is going, what impact I'm having as well. That's a missing piece sometimes when we're talking about assessment overall. And I'll just refer to one very simple practice that's been around for ages, it's been around for decades, and that's the muddiest point. And the muddiest point is simply saying midway through a lesson, stopping that instruction or pausing that instruction and posing to students, what has been the muddiest point for you so far in this lesson? And what underlies that is an assumption that there are going to be kids who aren't quite understanding what it is that's happening. That's a very different assumption than simply saying, does everybody get that? Okay. Do you understand? And they all nod their heads, right? But when you pause and you say, what's the muddiest point for you right now? You are making an assumption and communicating to students, yes, you're supposed to ask questions, you're supposed to self-reflect, and this gives me really good feedback halfway through the lesson.
I think one of the key things, Nancy, that you just said there too, that I want to be able to pull out a little bit is you talked about feedback back to the teacher. And I think too often we still see feedback as what we as the adults are supposed to be giving the kids. So the fact that you were just talking about, it's actually about the feedback we're getting from the students as well is really important. One of the other topics that you talk about in here is develop early warning systems for attendance, behavior, and course completion. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that because sometimes what we see in early warning systems sort of intersects with our discussion that I know the two of you have had a lot of, which is equity, but also a deficit mindset on the part of people. So how do you develop an early warning system for attendance, behavior, and course completion at the same time you might be recognizing the implicit bias you might have based on the color of somebody's skin or the zip code they're coming from?
And I'll start with that. The early warning systems, we've taken a lot of the advice of the research coming out of Johns Hopkins in particular about looking at attendance, behavior, and course completion, and not allowing as a school or as a system, not allowing patterns of potential problems that are there to just sort of fester and then, all of a sudden it's the end of the semester and see, well, that kid wasn't showing up to school or that kid was in trouble all the time. No wonder he didn't pass Algebra 1, right? So part of it is putting that system into place that says, we're going to make sure that we have eyes on kids and on ourselves about when it is that we are seeing emerging patterns for individual students around attendance. And then it's our job to be able to find out what are the barriers that are happening. Maybe something's happening with the family. They need some extra support for that. And in terms of behavior, I think that's where restorative practices have to go hand in hand with this, that it simply can't be referrals and we're just going to track referrals and so on. But with a robust restorative practices system, now you can look at potentially problematic behaviors or conflicts and look at them in a more holistic light. Who are the students that are involved? What were the circumstances? What are the outcomes for that? And then course completion, as I said, really becomes those outcomes around attendance problems, around potential behavior problems that might emerge.
It also requires that we start looking at root causes. Once we have the data, we don't just attribute the problem to the learner and say, oh, the parents don't care, the kid's lazy. We remove those labels and instead we start to say, what is the root cause of this? What are the things that are under our control as a school system to change this? And what is something that's a challenge for our society that we need a bigger system of support to address? I sent Nancy a study on kindergartners and attendance as an example. And the study showed that kindergarten absenteeism years later manifests in significant social and emotional challenges for the learner. Their identity, their sense of well-being was correlated highly with their attendance in school. And so it starts young, that we educators have a protective effect. We're in partnership with the family to grow up young people. And it was really interesting to think about, the optional year here in California and how important it is for kids to be there every day that they can be there, to be around other children, to be around caring adults, to have learning experiences and grow their sense of self. All of that was part of, this is why attendance is super important.
Yeah, I was a former primary school teacher for 11 years and a principal for 8. So I thank you for saying that, because I remember when I was first teaching first grade, I met somebody and they asked me what I did. And I said, I taught first grade. And they said, oh, how cute. Okay, come in and see my cute 30 first graders. Now, I know that your research and your writing and your work has had a huge impact on people, including me. How much of an impact has, many people might not know that you actually both have started a school years ago. So how much of an impact has that school had on the way that you both think?
I think it's how we think as we run a school. We opened it in 2007, and every decision, when we write, it's only because we're doing it at our school. Right. So when we wrote about distance learning, it was because we pivoted on March 13th. When we wrote about working on the rebound, it's because what we're doing at school. And it goes back to even our assessment stuff is, why are the teachers having this huge dichotomy in these conversations? No, it's formative. No, it's summative. Well, it's not. And so being around learners and their teachers and the reality of operating a complex business inside of a nested system keeps us real.
Mm-hmm.
Nancy, what would you add about our school?
We are so fortunate to get to collaborate with so many talented educators who push back on our thinking too, who ask us questions, who challenge assumptions, who invite us to be able to look at things in different ways. I'm not sure that that we would be able to produce information the way that we do if we didn't have those humane and growth producing conversations that happen at school on a regular basis. We are truly fortunate to be able to collaborate with these people.
Yeah, you certainly don't have an ivory tower approach. You both are in it. So I know that. So this whole season has been on rekindling engagement. You are our last interview, our last podcast for the season. So as people go to pick up Leading the Rebound, what is one key takeaway that you want them to leave with your book? What's one key takeaway from this book that you want people to have? Nancy?
I think for myself, that key takeaway is that we are at an incredible moment in history where we get to be able to reconceive what schooling looks like. And let's not waste that opportunity. This is the perfect time for us to really consider what are those things that have been working well during this last year? How is it that we bring those forward? And what are those things that we have known for a long time haven't been working well? Those inequities that have been exposed by the twin pandemics of both disease as well as racial injustice. What are the ways that we can reconceive, reimagine what it is that school looks like?
And I would add that the teachers, the students, the families look to you for your leadership. They look to you for confidence. They look to you for direction. And right now, like never before, leadership is going to matter. And the conversations we have and the decisions we make will either allow this system to rebound and grow, or we are going to be admiring all these problems and exacerbating deficit thinking because it's up to us as leaders to lead.
The book is Leading the Rebound. Doug Fisher and Nancy Frey, it is always a pleasure to talk to you. Both, thank you for being a part of the Coaching Leaders podcast.
Thank you so much, Peter, for inviting us. And it is always a pleasure to talk with you.
Great to talk to you. Great to see you. Stay safe.
Errol, I have to say that it was a great way to end our
That's right.
We were looking at rekindling engagement, and Leading the Rebound is, what a great title to have as far as rekindling that kind of engagement. What I enjoy about these podcasts, and specifically enjoyed with Doug and Nancy, is the way that they not only can speak to the research, but they can speak to the practical elements, and it comes from an authentic place because we know, and it's what we ended with, that school that they started in 2007 has an impact on them.
That's right. Yeah. And I love what Nancy said of just, kind of leaving us with this idea of it's time to rethink what school can look like. And Doug's kind of challenge at the end there saying, we can either contribute to what school is going to look like going forward, or we can contribute to the negative thinking and the deficit mindset. It's up to us as leaders. So what's the choice going to be? And I think that's a great way to end our last episode for this season. So for those listening or watching, I hope that you leave a review, subscribe if you haven't already. We are going on a little summer break, and we will be back in August with season 2. And our focus for season 2 is going to be on leading teams. So lots of conversations about collaboration and collective efficacy up ahead. I hope that you all have a wonderful summer and join us again in August.
Yes, thank you to everybody who has been listening all along. If this was the first podcast of ours that you listen to, feel free to binge listen to the other ones because they're equally as important. But yes, have a great summer and we look forward to seeing you again in August.
Thanks, Peter.
All right, thanks, Ariel.